The Emperor's New Clothes. Many years ago, there was an emperor who was so excessively fond of new clothes that he spent all his money in dress. He did not trouble himself in the least about his soldiers, nor did he care to go either to the theatre or the chase, except for the opportunities then afforded him for displaying his new clothes. He had a different suit for each hour of the day, and as of any other king or emperor, one is accustomed to say, he is sitting in council, it was always said of him, the emperor is sitting in his wardrobe. Time passed merrily in the large town, which was his capital. Strangers arrived every day at the court. One day, two rogues, calling themselves weavers, made their appearance. They gave out that they knew how to weave stuffs of the most beautiful colors and elaborate patterns, the clothes manufactured from which should have the wonderful property of remaining invisible to everyone who was unfit for the office he held, or who was extraordinarily simple in character.
These must, indeed, be splendid clothes,
thought the emperor.
Had I such a suit, I might at once find out what men in my realms are unfit for their office, and also be able to distinguish the wise from the foolish. This stuff must be woven for me immediately.
And he caused large sums of money to be given to both the weavers in order that they might begin their work directly. So the two pretended weavers set up two looms, and affected to work very busily, though in reality they did nothing at all. They asked for the most delicate silk and the purest gold thread, put both into their own knapsacks, and then continued their pretended work at the empty looms until late at night.
I should like to know how the weavers are getting on with my cloth,
said the emperor to himself. After some little time had elapsed, he was, however, rather embarrassed when he remembered that a simpleton, or one unfit for his office, would be unable to see the manufacture. To be sure, he thought he had nothing to risk in his own person, but yet, he would prefer sending somebody else to bring him intelligence about the weavers and their work before he troubled himself in the affair. All the people throughout the city had heard of the wonderful property the cloth was to possess, and all were anxious to learn how wise, or how ignorant, their neighbors might prove to be.
I will send my faithful old minister to the weavers,
said the emperor at last, after some deliberation. He will be best able to see how the cloth looks, for he is a man of sense, and no one can be more suitable for his office than he is. So the faithful old minister went into the hall, where the knaves were working with all their might, at their empty looms.
What can be the meaning of this?
thought the old man, opening his eyes very wide.
I cannot discover the least bit of thread on the looms.
However, he did not express his thoughts aloud. The impostors requested him very courteously to be so good as to come nearer their looms, and then asked him whether the design pleased him, and whether the colors were not very beautiful, at the same time pointing to the empty frames. The poor old minister looked and looked. He could not discover anything on the looms, for a very good reason, viz., there was nothing there.
What?
thought he again.
Is it possible that I am a simpleton? I have never thought so myself, and no one must know it now if I am so. Can it be that I am unfit for my office? No, that must not be said either. I will never confess that I could not see the stuff. Well, Sir Minister,
said one of the knaves, still pretending to work.
You do not say whether the stuff pleases you. Oh, it is excellent,
replied the old minister, looking at the loom through his spectacles.
This pattern, and the colors, yes, I will tell the emperor without delay, how very beautiful I think them. We shall be much obliged to you,
said the impostors, and then they named the different colors and described the pattern of the pretended stuff. The old minister listened attentively to their words, in order that he might repeat them to the emperor, and then the knaves asked for more silk and gold, saying that it was necessary to complete what they had begun. However, they put all that was given them into their knapsacks, and continued to work with as much apparent diligence as before at their empty looms. The emperor now sent another officer of his court to see how the men were getting on, and to ascertain whether the cloth would soon be ready. It was just the same with this gentleman as with the minister. He surveyed the looms on all sides, but could see nothing at all but the empty frames.
Does not the stuff appear as beautiful to you, as it did to my lord the minister?
Asked the impostors of the emperor's second ambassador, at the same time making the same gestures as before, and talking of the design and colors which were not there.
I certainly am not stupid,
thought the messenger.
It must be, that I am not fit for my good, profitable office. That is very odd, however, no one shall know anything about it.
And accordingly he praised the stuff he could not see, and declared that he was delighted with both colors and patterns.
Indeed, please your imperial majesty,
said he to his sovereign when he returned, the cloth which the weavers are preparing is extraordinarily magnificent. The whole city was talking of the splendid cloth, which the emperor had ordered to be woven at his own expense. And now the emperor himself wished to see the costly manufacture, while it was still in the loom. Accompanied by a select number of officers of the court, among whom were the two honest men, who had already admired the cloth, he went to the crafty impostors, who, as soon as they were aware of the emperor's approach, went on working more diligently than ever, although they still did not pass a single thread through the looms.
Is not the work absolutely magnificent?
Said the two officers of the crown, already mentioned.
If your majesty will only be pleased to look at it. What a splendid design! What glorious colors!
And at the same time they pointed to the empty frames, for they imagined that everyone else could see this exquisite piece of workmanship.
How is this?
Said the emperor to himself.
I can see nothing. This is indeed a terrible affair. Am I a simpleton, or am I unfit to be an emperor? That would be the worst thing that could happen, oh. The cloth is charming,
said he, aloud.
It has my complete approbation.
And he smiled most graciously, and looked closely at the empty looms, for on no account would he say that he could not see what two of the officers of his court had praised so much. All his retinue now strained their eyes, hoping to discover something on the looms, but they could see no more than the others. Nevertheless, they all exclaimed, "Oh, how beautiful!" and advised his majesty to have some new clothes made from this splendid material, for the approaching procession.
Magnificent! Charming! Excellent!
Resounded on all sides, and everyone was uncommonly gay. The emperor shared in the general satisfaction, and presented the impostors with the riband of an order of knighthood, to be worn in their buttonholes, and the title of gentlemen weavers. The rogues set up the whole of the night before the day on which the procession was to take place, and had 16 lights burning, so that everyone might see how anxious they were to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to roll the cloth off the looms, cut the air with their scissors, and sewed with needles without any thread in them.
See!
Cried they, at last.
The emperor's new clothes are ready.
And now the emperor, with all the grandees of his court, came to the weavers, and the rogues raised their arms, as if in the act of holding something up, saying, "Here are your majesty's trousers.
Here is the scarf. Here is the mantle. The whole suit is as light as a cobweb. One might fancy one has nothing at all on, when dressed in it. That, however, is the great virtue of this delicate cloth." Yes, indeed,
said all the courtiers, although not one of them could see anything of this exquisite manufacture.
If your imperial majesty will be graciously pleased to take off your clothes, we will fit on the new suit, in front of the looking-glass.
The emperor was accordingly undressed, and the rogues pretended to array him in his new suit, the emperor turning round, from side to side, before the looking-glass.
How splendid his majesty looks in his new clothes, and how well they fit!
Everyone cried out.
What a design! What colors! These are indeed royal robes. The canopy, which is to be borne over your majesty, in the procession, is waiting,
announced the chief master of the ceremonies.
I am quite ready,
answered the emperor.
Do my new clothes fit well?
Asked he, turning himself round again before the looking-glass, in order that he might appear to be examining his handsome suit. The lords of the bedchamber, who were to carry his majesty's train, felt about on the ground, as if they were lifting up the ends of the mantle, and pretended to be carrying something, for they would by no means betray anything like simplicity, or unfitness for their office. So now the emperor walked under his high canopy in the midst of the procession, through the streets of his capital, and all the people standing by, and those at the windows, cried out, "Oh,
how beautiful are our emperor's new clothes! What a magnificent train there is to the mantle, and how gracefully the scarf hangs!"
In short, no one would allow that he could not see these much admired clothes, because, in doing so, he would have declared himself either a simpleton, or unfit for his office. Certainly, none of the emperor's various suits had ever made so great an impression as these invisible ones.
"But the emperor has nothing at all on,"
said a little child.
"Listen to the voice of innocence,"
exclaimed his father, and what the child had said was whispered from one to another.
"But he has nothing at all on,"
at last cried out all the people. The emperor was vexed, for he knew that the people were right, but he thought the procession must go on now. And the lords of the bedchamber took greater pains than ever to appear holding up a train, although, in reality, there was no train to hold. The fir tree. Out in the woods stood a nice little fir tree. The place he had was a very good one, the sun shone on him, as to fresh air, there was enough of that, and round him grew many large-sized comrades, pines as well as firs. But the little fir wanted so very much to be a grown-up tree. He did not think of the warm sun and of the fresh air, he did not care for the little cottage children that ran about and prattled when they were in the woods looking for wild strawberries. The children often came with a whole pitcher full of berries, or a long row of them threaded on a straw, and sat down near the young tree and said, "Oh, how pretty he is!
What a nice little fir!"
But this was what the tree could not bear to hear. At the end of a year he had shot up a good deal, and after another year he was another long bit taller, for with fir trees one can always tell by the shoots how many years old they are.
"Oh, were I but such a high tree as the others are,"
sighed he.
"Then I should be able to spread out my branches, and with the tops to look into the wide world. Then would the birds build nests among my branches, and when there was a breeze, I could bend with as much stateliness as the others."
Neither the sunbeams, nor the birds, nor the red clouds which morning and evening sailed above him, gave the little tree any pleasure. In winter, when the snow lay glittering on the ground, a hare would often come leaping along, and jump right over the little tree. Oh, that made him so angry. But 2 winters were past, and in the third the tree was so large that the hare was obliged to go round it.
"To grow and grow, to get older and be tall,"
thought the tree, that, after all, is the most delightful thing in the world. In autumn the woodcutters always came and felled some of the largest trees. This happened every year, and the young fir tree, that had now grown to a very comely size, trembled at the sight, for the magnificent great trees fell to the earth with noise and cracking, the branches were lopped off, and the trees looked long and bare, they were hardly to be recognized, and then they were laid in carts, and the horses dragged them out of the wood. Where did they go to? What became of them? In spring, when the swallows and the storks came, the tree asked them, "Don't you know where they have been taken?
Have you not met them anywhere?"
The swallows did not know anything about it, but the stork looked musing, nodded his head, and said, "Yes, I think I know. I met many ships as I was flying hither from Egypt, on the ships were magnificent masts, and I venture to assert that it was they that smelt so of fir."
"I may congratulate you, for they lifted themselves on high most majestically. Oh, were I but old enough to fly across the sea! But how does the sea look in reality? What is it like?" "That would take a long time to explain,"
said the stork, and with these words off he went.
"Rejoice in thy growth,"
said the sunbeams.
"Rejoice in thy vigorous growth, and in the fresh life that moveth within thee."
And the wind kissed the tree, and the dew wept tears over him, but the fir understood it not. When Christmas came, quite young trees were cut down, trees which often were not even as large or of the same age as this fir tree, who could never rest, but always wanted to be off. These young trees, and they were always the finest looking, retained their branches. They were laid on carts, and the horses drew them out of the wood.
Where are they going to?
Asked the fir.
They are not taller than I. There was one indeed that was considerably shorter. And why do they retain all their branches? Whither are they taken? We know. We know.
Chirped the sparrows.
We have peeped in at the windows in the town below. We know whither they are taken. The greatest splendor and the greatest magnificence one can imagine await them. We peeped through the windows, and saw them planted in the middle of the warm room and ornamented with the most splendid things, with gilded apples, with gingerbread, with toys, and many hundred lights. And then?
Asked the fir tree, trembling in every bough.
And then? What happens then? We did not see anything more. It was incomparably beautiful. I would fain know if I am destined for so glorious a career,
cried the tree, rejoicing.
That is still better than to cross the sea. What a longing do I suffer! Were Christmas but come! I am now tall, and my branches spread like the others that were carried off last year. Oh! Were I but already on the cart! Were I in the warm room with all the splendor and magnificence! Yes, then something better, something still grander, will surely follow, or wherefore should they thus ornament me? Something better, something still grander must follow, but what? Oh, how I long, how I suffer! I do not know myself what is the matter with me. Rejoice in our presence,
said the air and the sunlight.
Rejoice in thy own fresh youth.
But the tree did not rejoice at all. He grew and was green both winter and summer. People that saw him said, "What a fine tree!" And towards Christmas, he was one of the first that was cut down. The axe struck deep into the very pith. The tree fell to the earth with a sigh. He felt a pang. It was like a swoon. He could not think of happiness, for he was sorrowful at being separated from his home, from the place where he had sprung up. He well knew that he should never see his dear old comrades, the little bushes and flowers around him, any more, perhaps not even the birds. The departure was not at all agreeable. The tree only came to himself when he was unloaded in a courtyard with the other trees, and heard a man say, "That one is splendid.
We don't want the others."
Then 2 servants came in rich livery, and carried the fir tree into a large and splendid drawing-room. Portraits were hanging on the walls, and near the white porcelain stove stood 2 large Chinese vases with lions on the covers. There, too, were large easy chairs, silken sofas, large tables full of picture books and full of toys, worth hundreds and hundreds of crowns, at least the children said so. And the fir tree was stuck upright in a cask that was filled with sand, but no one could see that it was a cask, for green cloth was hung all round it, and it stood on a large gaily colored carpet. Oh! How the tree quivered! What was to happen? The servants, as well as the young ladies, decorated it. On one branch there hung little nets cut out of colored paper, and each net was filled with sugar plums, and among the other boughs gilded apples and walnuts were suspended, looking as though they had grown there, and little blue and white tapers were placed among the leaves. Dolls that looked for all the world like men, the tree had never beheld such before, were seen among the foliage, and at the very top a large star of gold tinsel was fixed. It was really splendid, beyond description splendid.
This evening,
they all said.
How it will shine this evening! Oh!
Thought the tree.
If the evening were but come! If the tapers were but lighted! And then I wonder what will happen. Perhaps the other trees from the forest will come to look at me. Perhaps the sparrows will beat against the window panes. I wonder if I shall take root here, and winter and summer stand covered with ornaments.
He knew very much about the matter, but he was so impatient that for sheer longing he got a pain in his back, and this with trees is the same thing as a headache with us. The candles were now lighted. What brightness! What splendor! The tree trembled so in every bough that one of the tapers set fire to the foliage. It blazed up famously.
Help! Help!
Cried the young ladies, and they quickly put out the fire. Now the tree did not even dare tremble. What a state he was in! He was so uneasy lest he should lose something of his splendor, that he was quite bewildered amidst the glare and brightness, when suddenly both folding doors opened and a troop of children rushed in, as if they would upset the tree. The older persons followed quietly, the little ones stood quite still. But it was only for a moment, then they shouted that the whole place re-echoed with their rejoicing. They danced round the tree, and one present after the other was pulled off.
What are they about?
Thought the tree.
What is to happen now?
And the lights burned down to the very branches, and as they burned down they were put out one after the other, and then the children had permission to plunder the tree. So they fell upon it with such violence that all its branches cracked. If it had not been fixed firmly in the ground, it would certainly have tumbled down. The children danced about with their beautiful playthings. No one looked at the tree except the old nurse, who peeped between the branches. But it was only to see if there was a fig or an apple left that had been forgotten.
A story! A story!
Cried the children, drawing a little fat man towards the tree. He seated himself under it and said, "Now we are in the shade, and the tree can listen too.
But I shall tell only one story. Now which will you have, that about Ivediavedi, or about Humpy Dumpy, who tumbled downstairs, and yet after all came to the throne and married the princess?" Ivediavedi,
cried some. Humpy Dumpy, cried the others. There was such a bawling and screaming, the fir tree alone was silent, and he thought to himself, "Am I not to bawl with the rest?
Am I to do nothing whatever?"
For he was one of the company, and had done what he had to do. And the man told about Humpy Dumpy that tumbled down, who notwithstanding came to the throne, and at last married the princess. And the children clapped their hands, and cried,
"Oh, go on. Do go on."
They wanted to hear about Ivediavedi too, but the little man only told them about Humpy Dumpy. The fir tree stood quite still and absorbed in thought. The birds in the wood had never related the like of this.
Humpy Dumpy fell downstairs, and yet he married the princess. Yes, yes. That's the way of the world.
Thought the fir tree, and believed it all, because the man who told the story was so good-looking.
Well, well. Who knows, perhaps I may fall downstairs too, and get a princess as wife.
And he looked forward with joy to the morrow, when he hoped to be decked out again with lights, playthings, fruits, and tinsel.
I won't tremble tomorrow.
Thought the fir tree.
I will enjoy to the full all my splendor. Tomorrow I shall hear again the story of Humpy Dumpy, and perhaps that of Ivediavedi too.
And the whole night the tree stood still and in deep thought. In the morning the servant and the housemaid came in.
Now then the splendor will begin again.
Thought the fir. But they dragged him out of the room, and up the stairs into the loft, and here, in a dark corner, where no daylight could enter, they left him.
What's the meaning of this?
Thought the tree.
What am I to do here? What shall I hear now, I wonder?
And he leaned against the wall lost in reverie. Time enough had he too for his reflections. 4 days and nights passed on, and nobody came up. And when at last somebody did come, it was only to put some great trunks in a corner, out of the way. There stood the tree quite hidden. It seemed as if he had been entirely forgotten.
'Tis now winter out of doors.
Thought the tree.
The earth is hard and covered with snow, men cannot plant me now, and therefore I have been put up here under shelter till the springtime comes. How thoughtful that is! How kind man is, after all! If it only were not so dark here, and so terribly lonely. Not even a hare. And out in the woods it was so pleasant, when the snow was on the ground, and the hare leaped by, yes, even when he jumped over me, but I did not like it then. It is really terribly lonely here. Squeak! Squeak!
Said a little mouse, at the same moment, peeping out of his hole. And then another little one came. They snuffed about the fir tree, and rustled among the branches.
"It is dreadfully cold,"
said the mouse.
"but for that, it would be delightful here, old fir, wouldn't it?" "I am by no means old,"
said the fir tree.
"There's many a one considerably older than I am." "Where do you come from?"
asked the mice, "and what can you do?" They were so extremely curious.
"Tell us about the most beautiful spot on the earth. Have you never been there? Were you never in the larder, where cheeses lie on the shelves, and hams hang from above, where one dances about on tallow candles, that place where one enters lean, and comes out again fat and portly?" "I know no such place,"
said the tree.
"but I know the wood, where the sun shines and where the little birds sing."
And then he told all about his youth, and the little mice had never heard the like before, and they listened and said,
"Well, to be sure. How much you have seen. How happy you must have been." "I,"
said the fir tree, thinking over what he had himself related.
"Yes, in reality those were happy times."
And then he told about Christmas Eve, when he was decked out with cakes and candles.
"Oh,"
said the little mice, "how fortunate you have been, old fir tree."
"I am by no means old,"
said he.
"I came from the wood this winter, I am in my prime, and am only rather short for my age." "What delightful stories you know,"
said the mice, and the next night they came with 4 other little mice, who were to hear what the tree recounted, and the more he related, the more he remembered himself, and it appeared as if those times had really been happy times.
"But they may still come, they may still come. Humpy Dumpy fell downstairs, and yet he got a princess."
And he thought at the moment of a nice little birch tree growing out in the woods, to the fir, that would be a real charming princess.
"Who is Humpy Dumpy?"
asked the mice. So then the fir tree told the whole fairy tale, for he could remember every single word of it, and the little mice jumped for joy up to the very top of the tree. Next night 2 more mice came, and on Sunday 2 rats even, but they said the stories were not interesting, which vexed the little mice, and they, too, now began to think them not so very amusing either.
"Do you know only one story?"
asked the rats.
"Only that one,"
answered the tree.
"I heard it on my happiest evening, but I did not then know how happy I was. It is a very stupid story. Don't you know one about bacon and tallow candles? Can't you tell any larder stories?" "No,"
said the tree.
"Then goodbye,"
said the rats, and they went home. At last the little mice stayed away also, and the tree sighed, "After all, it was very pleasant when the sleek little mice sat round me, and listened to what I told them.
Now that too is over. But I will take good care to enjoy myself when I am brought out again."
But when was that to be? Why, one morning there came a quantity of people, and set to work in the loft. The trunks were moved, the tree was pulled out and thrown, rather hard, it is true, down on the floor, but a man drew him towards the stairs, where the daylight shone.
"Now a merry life will begin again,"
thought the tree. He felt the fresh air, the first sunbeam, and now he was out in the courtyard. All passed so quickly, there was so much going on around him, the tree quite forgot to look to himself. The court adjoined a garden, and all was in flower. The roses hung so fresh and odorous over the balustrade, the lindens were in blossom, the swallows flew by, and said, "Quervit,
"My husband is come."
But it was not the fir tree that they meant.
"Now, then, I shall really enjoy life,"
said he exultingly, and spread out his branches, but, alas, they were all withered and yellow. It was in a corner that he lay, among weeds and nettles. The golden star of tinsel was still on the top of the tree, and glittered in the sunshine. In the courtyard some of the merry children were playing who had danced at Christmas round the fir tree, and were so glad at the sight of him. One of the youngest ran and tore off the golden star.
"Only look what is still on the ugly old Christmas tree,"
said he, trampling on the branches, so that they all cracked beneath his feet. And the tree beheld all the beauty of the flowers, and the freshness in the garden. He beheld himself, and wished he had remained in his dark corner in the loft. He thought of his first youth in the wood, of the merry Christmas Eve, and of the little mice who had listened with so much pleasure to the story of Humpy Dumpy.
"'Tis over, 'tis past,"
said the poor tree.
"Had I but rejoiced when I had reason to do so. But now 'tis past, 'tis past."
And the gardener's boy chopped the tree into small pieces. There was a whole heap lying there. The wood flamed up splendidly under the large brewing copper, and it sighed so deeply. Each sigh was like a shot. The boys played about in the court, and the youngest wore the gold star on his breast which the tree had had on the happiest evening of his life. However, that was over now, the tree gone, the story at an end. All was over, every tale must end at last. The leapfrog. A flea, a grasshopper, and a leapfrog once wanted to see which could jump highest, and they invited the whole world, and everybody else besides who chose to come to see the festival. 3 famous jumpers were they, as everyone would say, when they all met together in the room.
"I will give my daughter to him who jumps highest,"
exclaimed the king, "for it is not so amusing where there is no prize to jump for." The flea was the first to step forward. He had exquisite manners, and bowed to the company on all sides, for he had noble blood, and was, moreover, accustomed to the society of man alone, and that makes a great difference. Then came the grasshopper. He was considerably heavier, but he was well-mannered, and wore a green uniform, which he had by right of birth. He said, moreover, that he belonged to a very ancient Egyptian family, and that in the house where he then was, he was thought much of. The fact was, he had been just brought out of the fields, and put in a pasteboard house, 3 stories high, all made of court cards, with the coloured side inwards, and doors and windows cut out of the body of the Queen of Hearts.
"I sing so well,"
said he, "that 16 native grasshoppers who have chirped from infancy, and yet got no house built of cards to live in, grew thinner than they were before for sheer vexation, when they heard me." It was thus that the flea and the grasshopper gave an account of themselves, and thought they were quite good enough to marry a princess. The leapfrog said nothing, but people gave it as their opinion, that he therefore thought the more, and when the housedog snuffed at him with his nose, he confessed the leapfrog was of good family. The old counsellor, who had had 3 orders given him to make him hold his tongue, asserted that the leapfrog was a prophet, for that one could see on his back, if there would be a severe or mild winter, and that was what one could not see even on the back of the man who writes the almanac.
"I say nothing, it is true,"
exclaimed the king, "but I have my own opinion, notwithstanding." Now the trial was to take place. The flea jumped so high that nobody could see where he went to, so they all asserted he had not jumped at all, and that was dishonourable. The grasshopper jumped only half as high, but he leaped into the king's face, who said that was ill-mannered. The leapfrog stood still for a long time lost in thought. It was believed at last he would not jump at all.
"I only hope he is not unwell,"
said the housedog, when, pop, he made a jump all on one side into the lap of the princess, who was sitting on a little golden stool close by. Hereupon the king said, "There is nothing above my daughter, therefore to bound up to her is the highest jump that can be made, but for this, one must possess understanding, and the leapfrog has shown that he has understanding.
"He is brave and intellectual."
And so he won the princess.
"It's all the same to me,"
said the flea.
"She may have the old leapfrog, for all I care. I jumped the highest, but in this world merit seldom meets its reward. A fine exterior is what people look at nowadays."
The flea then went into foreign service, where, it is said, he was killed. The grasshopper sat without on a green bank, and reflected on worldly things, and he said too, "Yes, a fine exterior is everything, a fine exterior is what people care about." And then he began chirping his peculiar melancholy song, from which we have taken this history, and which may, very possibly, be all untrue, although it does stand here printed in black and white. The Little Match Girl. Most terribly cold it was, it snowed, and was nearly quite dark, and evening, the last evening of the year. In this cold and darkness there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded, and with naked feet. When she left home she had slippers on, it is true, but what was the good of that? They were very large slippers, which her mother had hitherto worn, so large were they, and the poor little thing lost them as she scuffled away across the street, because of two carriages that rolled by dreadfully fast. One slipper was nowhere to be found, the other had been laid hold of by an urchin, and off he ran with it. He thought it would do capitally for a cradle when he some day or other should have children himself. So the little maiden walked on with her tiny naked feet, that were quite red and blue from cold. She carried a quantity of matches in an old apron, and she held a bundle of them in her hand. Nobody had bought anything of her the whole livelong day, no one had given her a single farthing. She crept along trembling with cold and hunger, a very picture of sorrow, the poor little thing. The flakes of snow covered her long fair hair, which fell in beautiful curls around her neck, but of that, of course, she never once now thought. From all the windows the candles were gleaming, and it smelt so deliciously of roast goose, for you know it was New Year's Eve, yes, of that she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, of which one advanced more than the other, she seated herself down and cowered together. Her little feet she had drawn close up to her, but she grew colder and colder, and to go home she did not venture, for she had not sold any matches, and could not bring a farthing of money. From her father she would certainly get blows, and at home it was cold too, for above her she had only the roof, through which the wind whistled, even though the largest cracks were stopped up with straw and rags. Her little hands were almost numbed with cold. Oh! A match might afford her a world of comfort, if she only dared take a single one out of the bundle. Draw it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. She drew one out.
Risht!
How it blazed, how it burnt! It was a warm, bright flame, like a candle. As she held her hands over it, it was a wonderful light. It seemed really to the little maiden, as though she was sitting before a large iron stove, with burnished brass feet, and a brass ornament at top. The fire burned with such blessed influence, it warmed so delightfully. The little girl had already stretched out her feet to warm them too, but the small flame went out, the stove vanished, she had only the remains of the burnt-out match in her hand. She rubbed another against the wall, it burned brightly, and where the light fell on the wall, there the wall became transparent like a veil, so that she could see into the room. On the table was spread a snow-white tablecloth. Upon it was a splendid porcelain service, and the roast goose was steaming famously with its stuffing of apple and dried plums. And what was still more capital to behold was, the goose hopped down from the dish, reeled about on the floor with knife and fork in its breast, till it came up to the poor little girl, when the match went out and nothing but the thick, cold, damp wall was left behind. She lighted another match. Now there she was sitting under the most magnificent Christmas tree. It was still larger, and more decorated than the one which she had seen through the glass door in the rich merchant's house. Thousands of lights were burning on the green branches, and gaily colored pictures, such as she had seen in the shop windows, looked down upon her. The little maiden stretched out her hands towards them when the match went out. The lights of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them now as stars in heaven. One fell down and formed a long trail of fire.
Someone is just dead,
said the little girl, for her old grandmother, the only person who had loved her, and who was now no more, had told her that when a star falls, a soul ascends to God. She drew another match against the wall. It was again light, and in the lustre there stood the old grandmother, so bright and radiant, so mild, and with such an expression of love.
Grandmother,
cried the little one.
Oh, take me with you. You go away when the match burns out, you vanish like the warm stove, like the delicious roast goose, and like the magnificent Christmas tree.
And she rubbed the whole bundle of matches quickly against the wall, for she wanted to be quite sure of keeping her grandmother near her. And the matches gave such a brilliant light that it was brighter than at noonday. Never formerly had the grandmother been so beautiful and so tall. She took the little maiden on her arm, and both flew in brightness and in joy so high, so very high, and then above was neither cold, nor hunger, nor anxiety, they were with God. But in the corner, at the cold hour of dawn, sat the poor girl, with rosy cheeks and with a smiling mouth, leaning against the wall, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and stark sat the child there with her matches, of which one bundle had been burnt.
She wanted to warm herself,
people said. No one had the slightest suspicion of what beautiful things she had seen, no one even dreamed of the splendor in which, with her grandmother, she had entered on the joys of a new year. The real princess. There was once a prince who wished to marry a princess, but then she must be a real princess. He traveled all over the world in hopes of finding such a lady, but there was always something wrong. Princesses he found in plenty, but whether they were real princesses it was impossible for him to decide, for now one thing, now another, seemed to him not quite right about the ladies. At last he returned to his palace quite cast down, because he wished so much to have a real princess for his wife. One evening a fearful tempest arose, it thundered and lightened, and the rain poured down from the sky in torrents, besides, it was as dark as pitch. All at once there was heard a violent knocking at the door, and the old king, the prince's father, went out himself to open it. It was a princess, who was standing outside the door. What with the rain and the wind, she was in a sad condition, the water trickled down from her hair, and her clothes clung to her body. She said she was a real princess.
Ah! We shall soon see that,
thought the old queen mother. However, she said not a word of what she was going to do, but went quietly into the bedroom, took all the bedclothes off the bed, and put 3 little peas on the bedstead. She then laid 20 mattresses one upon another over the 3 peas, and put 20 feather beds over the mattresses. Upon this bed the princess was to pass the night. The next morning she was asked how she had slept.
Oh, very badly indeed,
she replied.
I have scarcely closed my eyes the whole night through. I do not know what was in my bed, but I had something hard under me, and am all over black and blue. It has hurt me so much.
Now it was plain that the lady must be a real princess, since she had been able to feel the 3 little peas through the 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds. None but a real princess could have had such a delicate sense of feeling. The prince accordingly made her his wife, being now convinced that he had found a real princess. The 3 peas were however put into the cabinet of curiosities, where they are still to be seen, provided they are not lost. Wasn't this a lady of real delicacy? The false collar. There was once a fine gentleman, all of whose movables were a boot jack and a haircomb, but he had the finest false collars in the world, and it is about one of these collars that we are now to hear a story. It was so old, that it began to think of marriage, and it happened that it came to be washed in company with a garter.
Nay,
said the collar,
I never did see anything so slender and so fine, so soft and so neat. May I not ask your name? That I shall not tell you,
said the garter.
Where do you live?
Asked the collar. But the garter was so bashful, so modest, and thought it was a strange question to answer.
You are certainly a girdle,
said the collar, that is to say an inside girdle.
I see well that you are both for use and ornament, my dear young lady. I will thank you not to speak to me,
said the garter.
I think I have not given the least occasion for it. Yes, when one is as handsome as you,
said the collar, that is occasion enough.
Don't come so near me, I beg of you,
said the garter.
You look so much like those menfolks. I am also a fine gentleman,
said the collar.
I have a boot jack and a hair comb.
But that was not true, for it was his master who had them, but he boasted.
Don't come so near me,
said the garter, I am not accustomed to it.
Prude,
exclaimed the collar, and then it was taken out of the washing tub. It was starched, hung over the back of a chair in the sunshine, and was then laid on the ironing blanket. Then came the warm box iron.
Dear lady,
said the collar,
Dear widow lady, I feel quite hot. I am quite changed. I begin to unfold myself. You will burn a hole in me. Oh, I offer you my hand. Rag,
said the box iron, and went proudly over the collar, for she fancied she was a steam engine that would go on the railroad and draw the wagons.
Rag,
said the box iron. The collar was a little jagged at the edge, and so came the long scissors to cut off the jagged part.
Oh,
said the collar.
You are certainly the first opera dancer. How well you can stretch your legs out. It is the most graceful performance I have ever seen. No one can imitate you. I know it,
said the scissors.
You deserve to be a baroness,
said the collar.
All that I have is a fine gentleman, a boot jack, and a hair comb. If I only had the barony. Do you seek my hand?
Said the scissors, for she was angry, and without more ado, she cut him, and then he was condemned.
I shall now be obliged to ask the hair comb. It is surprising how well you preserve your teeth, miss,
said the collar.
Have you never thought of being betrothed? Yes, of course. You may be sure of that,
said the hair comb.
I am betrothed to the boot jack. Betrothed,
exclaimed the collar. Now there was no other to court, and so he despised it. A long time passed away, then the collar came into the rag chest at the paper mill. There was a large company of rags, the fine by themselves, and the coarse by themselves, just as it should be. They all had much to say, but the collar the most, for he was a real boaster.
I have had such an immense number of sweethearts,
said the collar.
I could not be in peace. It is true, I was always a fine starched-up gentleman. I had both a boot jack and a hair comb, which I never used. You should have seen me then, you should have seen me when I lay down. I shall never forget my first love. She was a girdle, so fine, so soft, and so charming, she threw herself into a tub of water for my sake. There was also a widow, who became glowing hot, but I left her standing till she got black again. There was also the first opera dancer, she gave me that cut which I now go with, she was so ferocious. My own hair comb was in love with me, she lost all her teeth from the heartache. Yes, I have lived to see much of that sort of thing, but I am extremely sorry for the garter, I mean the girdle, that went into the water tub. I have much on my conscience, I want to become white paper.
And it became so, all the rags were turned into white paper, but the collar came to be just this very piece of white paper we here see, and on which the story is printed, and that was because it boasted so terribly afterwards of what had never happened to it. It would be well for us to beware, that we may not act in a similar manner, for we can never know if we may not, in the course of time, also come into the rag chest, and be made into white paper, and then have our whole life's history printed on it, even the most secret, and be obliged to run about and tell it ourselves, just like this collar. The Happy Family. Really, the largest green leaf in this country is a dock leaf. If one holds it before one, it is like a whole apron, and if one holds it over one's head in rainy weather, it is almost as good as an umbrella, for it is so immensely large. The burdock never grows alone, but where there grows one there always grow several. It is a great delight, and all this delightfulness is snails' food. The great white snails which persons of quality in former times made fricassees of, ate, and said, hem, hem.
How delicious!
For they thought it tasted so delicate, lived on dock leaves, and therefore burdock seeds were sown. Now, there was an old manor house, where they no longer ate snails, they were quite extinct, but the burdocks were not extinct, they grew and grew all over the walks and all the beds. They could not get the mastery over them, it was a whole forest of burdocks. Here and there stood an apple and a plum tree, or else one never would have thought that it was a garden, all was burdocks, and there lived the two last venerable old snails. They themselves knew not how old they were, but they could remember very well that there had been many more, that they were of a family from foreign lands, and that for them and theirs the whole forest was planted. They had never been outside it, but they knew that there was still something more in the world, which was called the manor house, and that there they were boiled, and then they became black, and were then placed on a silver dish. But what happened further they knew not. Or, in fact, what it was to be boiled, and to lie on a silver dish, they could not possibly imagine, but it was said to be delightful, and particularly genteel. Neither the chafers, the toads, nor the earthworms, whom they asked about it could give them any information. None of them had been boiled or laid on a silver dish. The old white snails were the first persons of distinction in the world, that they knew. The forest was planted for their sake, and the manor house was there that they might be boiled and laid on a silver dish. Now they lived a very lonely and happy life, and as they had no children themselves, they had adopted a little common snail, which they brought up as their own, but the little one would not grow, for he was of a common family, but the old ones, especially Dame Mother Snail, thought they could observe how he increased in size, and she begged Father, if he could not see it, that he would at least feel the little snail's shell, and then he felt it, and found the good dame was right. One day there was a heavy storm of rain.
"Hear how it beats like a drum on the dock leaves,"
said Father Snail.
"There are also raindrops,"
said Mother Snail.
"And now the rain pours right down the stalk. You will see that it will be wet here. I am very happy to think that we have our good house, and the little one has his also. There is more done for us than for all other creatures, sure enough, but can you not see that we are folks of quality in the world? We are provided with a house from our birth, and the burdock forest is planted for our sakes. I should like to know how far it extends, and what there is outside." "There is nothing at all,"
said Father Snail.
"No place can be better than ours, and I have nothing to wish for." "Yes,"
said the dame,
"I would willingly go to the manor house, be boiled, and laid on a silver dish. All our forefathers have been treated so. There is something extraordinary in it, you may be sure. The manor house has most likely fallen to ruin,"
said Father Snail,
"or the burdocks have grown up over it, so that they cannot come out. There need not, however, be any haste about that, but you are always in such a tremendous hurry, and the little one is beginning to be the same. Has he not been creeping up that stalk these 3 days? It gives me a headache when I look up to him." "You must not scold him,"
said Mother Snail.
"He creeps so carefully, he will afford us much pleasure, and we have nothing but him to live for. But have you not thought of it? Where shall we get a wife for him? Do you not think that there are some of our species at a great distance in the interior of the burdock forest? Black snails, I dare say, there are enough of,"
said the old one.
"Black snails without a house, but they are so common, and so conceited. But we might give the ants a commission to look out for us. They run to and fro as if they had something to do, and they certainly know of a wife for our little snail." "I know one, sure enough, the most charming one,"
said one of the ants.
"But I am afraid we shall hardly succeed, for she is a queen." "That is nothing,"
said the old folks.
"Has she a house?" "She has a palace,"
said the ant.
"The finest ant's palace, with 700 passages." "I thank you,"
said Mother Snail.
"Our son shall not go into an anthill. If you know nothing better than that, we shall give the commission to the white gnats. They fly far and wide, in rain and sunshine, they know the whole forest here, both within and without. We have a wife for him,"
said the gnats.
"At 100 human paces from here there sits a little snail in her house, on a gooseberry bush. She is quite lonely, and old enough to be married. It is only 100 human paces." "Well, then, let her come to him,"
said the old ones.
"He has a whole forest of burdocks, she has only a bush."
And so they went and fetched little Miss Snail. It was a whole week before she arrived, but therein was just the very best of it, for one could thus see that she was of the same species. And then the marriage was celebrated. 6 earthworms shone as well as they could. In other respects the whole went off very quietly, for the old folks could not bear noise and merriment, but old Dame Snail made a brilliant speech. Father Snail could not speak, he was too much affected, and so they gave them as a dowry and inheritance, the whole forest of burdocks, and said, what they had always said, that it was the best in the world, and if they lived honestly and decently, and increased and multiplied, they and their children would once in the course of time come to the manor house, be boiled black, and laid on silver dishes. After this speech was made, the old ones crept into their shells, and never more came out. They slept, the young couple governed in the forest, and had a numerous progeny, but they were never boiled, and never came on the silver dishes, so from this they concluded that the manor house had fallen to ruins, and that all the men in the world were extinct. And as no one contradicted them, oh, of course it was so. And the rain beat on the dock leaves to make drum music for their sake, and the sun shone in order to give the burdock forest a colour for their sakes, and they were very happy, and the whole family was happy, for they indeed were so. The Naughty Boy. A long time ago, there lived an old poet, a thoroughly kind old poet. As he was sitting one evening in his room, a dreadful storm arose without, and the rain streamed down from heaven, but the old poet sat warm and comfortable in his chimney corner, where the fire blazed and the roasting apple hissed.
Those who have not a roof over their heads will be wetted to the skin,
said the good old poet.
Oh, let me in. Let me in. I am cold, and I am so wet,
exclaimed suddenly a child that stood crying at the door and knocking for admittance, while the rain poured down, and the wind made all the windows rattle.
Poor thing,
said the old poet, as he went to open the door. There stood a little boy, quite naked, and the water ran down from his long golden hair. He trembled with cold, and had he not come into a warm room he would most certainly have perished in the frightful tempest.
Poor child,
said the old poet, as he took the boy by the hand.
Come in, and I will soon restore thee. Thou shalt have wine and roasted apples, for thou art verily a charming child.
And the boy was so really. His eyes were like two bright stars, and although the water trickled down his hair, it waved in beautiful curls. He looked exactly like a little angel, but he was so pale, and his whole body trembled with cold. He had a nice little bow in his hand, but it was quite spoiled by the rain, and the tints of his many-coloured arrows ran one into the other. The old poet seated himself beside his hearth, and took the little fellow on his lap. He squeezed the water out of his dripping hair, warmed his hands between his own, and boiled for him some sweet wine. Then the boy recovered, his cheeks again grew rosy, he jumped down from the lap where he was sitting, and danced round the kind old poet.
You are a merry fellow,
said the old man.
What's your name? My name is Cupid,
answered the boy.
Don't you know me? There lies my bow, it shoots well, I can assure you. Look, the weather is now clearing up, and the moon is shining clear again through the window. Why, your bow is quite spoiled,
said the old poet.
That was sad indeed,
said the boy, and he took the bow in his hand and examined it on every side.
Oh, it is dry again, and is not hurt at all, the string is quite tight. I will try it directly.
And he bent his bow, took aim, and shot an arrow at the old poet, right into his heart.
You see now that my bow was not spoiled,
said he laughing, and away he ran. The naughty boy, to shoot the old poet in that way, he who had taken him into his warm room, who had treated him so kindly, and who had given him warm wine and the very best apples. The poor poet lay on the earth and wept, for the arrow had really flown into his heart.
Fie,
said he.
How naughty a boy Cupid is. I will tell all children about him, that they may take care, and not play with him, for he will only cause them sorrow and many a heartache.
And all good children to whom he related this story, took great heed of this naughty Cupid, but he made fools of them still, for he is astonishingly cunning. When the university students come from the lectures, he runs beside them in a black coat, and with a book under his arm. It is quite impossible for them to know him, and they walk along with him arm in arm, as if he, too, were a student like themselves, and then, unperceived, he thrusts an arrow to their bosom. When the young maidens come from being examined by the clergyman, or go to church to be confirmed, there he is again close behind them. Yes, he is forever following people. At the play, he sits in the great chandelier and burns in bright flames, so that people think it is really a flame, but they soon discover it is something else. He roves about in the garden of the palace and upon the ramparts. Yes, once he even shot your father and mother right in the heart. Ask them only and you will hear what they'll tell you. Oh, he is a naughty boy, that Cupid, you must never have anything to do with him. He is forever running after everybody. Only think, he shot an arrow once at your old grandmother. But that is a long time ago, and it is all past now, however, a thing of that sort she never forgets. Fie, naughty Cupid. But now you know him, and you know, too, how ill-behaved he is. The story of a mother. A mother sat there with her little child. She was so downcast, so afraid that it should die. It was so pale, the small eyes had closed themselves, and it drew its breath so softly, now and then, with a deep respiration, as if it sighed, and the mother looked still more sorrowfully on the little creature. Then a knocking was heard at the door, and in came a poor old man wrapped up as in a large horsecloth, for it warms one, and he needed it, as it was the cold winter season. Everything out of doors was covered with ice and snow, and the wind blew so that it cut the face. As the old man trembled with cold, and the little child slept a moment, the mother went and poured some ale into a pot and set it on the stove, that it might be warm for him. The old man sat and rocked the cradle, and the mother sat down on a chair close by him, and looked at her little sick child that drew its breath so deep, and raised its little hand.
Do you not think that I shall save him?
Said she.
Our Lord will not take him from me.
And the old man, it was Death himself, he nodded so strangely, it could just as well signify yes as no. And the mother looked down in her lap, and the tears ran down over her cheeks. Her head became so heavy, she had not closed her eyes for 3 days and nights, and now she slept, but only for a minute, when she started up and trembled with cold.
What is that?
Said she, and looked on all sides, but the old man was gone, and her little child was gone, he had taken it with him, and the old clock in the corner burred, the great leaden weight ran down to the floor, bump. And then the clock also stood still. But the poor mother ran out of the house and cried aloud for her child. Out there, in the midst of the snow, there sat a woman in long, black clothes, and she said, Death has been in thy chamber, and I saw him hasten away with thy little child. He goes faster than the wind, and he never brings back what he takes.
Oh, only tell me which way he went.
Said the mother.
Tell me the way, and I shall find him. I know it.
Said the woman in the black clothes.
But before I tell it, thou must first sing for me all the songs thou hast sung for thy child. I am fond of them. I have heard them before. I am knight, I saw thy tears whilst thou sangest them. I will sing them all.
Said the mother.
But do not stop me now. I may overtake him, I may find my child.
But Night stood still and mute. Then the mother wrung her hands, sang and wept, and there were many songs, but yet many more tears, and then Night said, Go to the right, into the dark pine forest, thither I saw Death take his way with thy little child. The roads crossed each other in the depths of the forest, and she no longer knew whither she should go. Then there stood a thorn bush, there was neither leaf nor flower on it, it was also in the cold winter season, and ice flakes hung on the branches.
Hast thou not seen Death go past with my little child?
Said the mother.
Yes,
said the thorn bush, but I will not tell thee which way he took, unless thou wilt first warm me up at thy heart.
I am freezing to death, I shall become a lump of ice.
And she pressed the thorn bush to her breast, so firmly, that it might be thoroughly warmed, and the thorns went right into her flesh, and her blood flowed in large drops, but the thorn bush shot forth fresh green leaves, and there came flowers on it in the cold winter night. The heart of the afflicted mother was so warm, and the thorn bush told her the way she should go. She then came to a large lake, where there was neither ship nor boat. The lake was not frozen sufficiently to bear her, neither was it open, nor low enough, that she could wade through it, and across it she must go if she would find her child. Then she lay down to drink up the lake, and that was an impossibility for a human being, but the afflicted mother thought that a miracle might happen nevertheless.
"Oh, what would I not give to come to my child?"
said the weeping mother, and she wept still more, and her eyes sunk down in the depths of the waters, and became two precious pearls, but the water bore her up, as if she sat in a swing, and she flew in the rocking waves to the shore on the opposite side, where there stood a mile-broad, strange house. One knew not if it were a mountain with forests and caverns, or if it were built up, but the poor mother could not see it. She had wept her eyes out.
"Where shall I find Death, who took away my little child?"
said she.
"He has not come here yet,"
said the old grave woman, who was appointed to look after Death's great greenhouse.
"How have you been able to find the way hither? And who has helped you?" "Our Lord has helped me,"
said she.
"He is merciful, and you will also be so. Where shall I find my little child?" "Nay, I know not,"
said the woman, "and you cannot see.
Many flowers and trees have withered this night. Death will soon come and plant them over again. You certainly know that every person has his or her life's tree or flower, just as everyone happens to be settled. They look like other plants, but they have pulsations of the heart. Children's hearts can also beat. Go after yours, perhaps you may know your child's, but what will you give me if I tell you what you shall do more?" "I have nothing to give,"
said the afflicted mother, "but I will go to the world's end for you."
"Nay, I have nothing to do there,"
said the woman.
"But you can give me your long black hair. You know yourself that it is fine, and that I like. You shall have my white hair instead, and that's always something. Do you demand nothing else?"
said she.
"That I will gladly give you."
And she gave her fine black hair, and got the old woman's snow-white hair instead. So they went into Death's great greenhouse, where flowers and trees grew strangely into one another. There stood fine hyacinths under glass bells, and there stood strong-stemmed peonies. There grew water plants, some so fresh, others half sick. The water snakes lay down on them, and black crabs pinched their stalks. There stood beautiful palm trees, oaks, and plantains. There stood parsley and flowering thyme. Every tree and every flower had its name. Each of them was a human life. The human frame still lived, one in China, and another in Greenland, round about in the world. There were large trees in small pots, so that they stood so stunted in growth, and ready to burst the pots. In other places, there was a little dull flower in rich mould, with moss round about it, and it was so petted and nursed. But the distressed mother bent down over all the smallest plants, and heard within them how the human heart beat, and amongst millions she knew her child's.
"There it is,"
cried she, and stretched her hands out over a little blue crocus, that hung quite sickly on one side.
"Don't touch the flower,"
said the old woman.
"But place yourself here, and when Death comes, I expect him every moment, do not let him pluck the flower up, but threaten him that you will do the same with the others. Then he will be afraid. He is responsible for them to our Lord, and no one dares to pluck them up before he gives leave."
All at once an icy cold rushed through the great hall, and the blind mother could feel that it was Death that came.
"How hast thou been able to find thy way hither?"
he asked.
"How couldst thou come quicker than I?" "I am a mother,"
said she. And Death stretched out his long hand towards the fine little flower, but she held her hands fast around his, so tight, and yet afraid that she should touch one of the leaves. Then Death blew on her hands, and she felt that it was colder than the cold wind, and her hands fell down powerless.
"Thou canst not do anything against me,"
said Death.
"But our Lord can,"
said she.
"I only do his bidding,"
said Death.
"I am his gardener. I take all his flowers and trees, and plant them out in the great garden of paradise, in the unknown land, but how they grow there, and how it is there I dare not tell thee. Give me back my child,"
said the mother, and she wept and prayed. At once she seized hold of two beautiful flowers close by, with each hand, and cried out to Death, "I will tear all thy flowers off, for I am in despair.
Touch them not,
Said Death.
thou sayest that thou art so unhappy, and now thou wilt make another mother equally unhappy. Another mother,
Said the poor woman, and directly let go her hold of both the flowers.
there, thou hast thine eyes,
Said Death, I fished them up from the lake, they shone so bright. I knew not they were thine.
take them again, they are now brighter than before, now look down into the deep well close by. I shall tell thee the names of the 2 flowers thou wouldst have torn up, and thou wilt see their whole future life, their whole human existence, and see what thou wast about to disturb and destroy.
And she looked down into the well, and it was a happiness to see how the one became a blessing to the world, to see how much happiness and joy were felt everywhere. And she saw the other's life, and it was sorrow and distress, horror and wretchedness.
Both of them are God's will.
Said Death.
Which of them is misfortune's flower, and which is that of happiness?
Asked she.
That I will not tell thee.
Said Death, but this thou shalt know from me, that the one flower was thy own child.
It was thy child's fate thou sawest, thy own child's future life.
Then the mother screamed with terror, which of them was my child?
Tell it me. Save the innocent. Save my child from all that misery. Rather take it away. Take it into God's kingdom. Forget my tears, forget my prayers, and all that I have done. I do not understand thee.
Said Death.
Wilt thou have thy child again, or shall I go with it there, where thou dost not know?
Then the mother wrung her hands, fell on her knees, and prayed to our Lord, Oh, hear me not when I pray against thy will, which is the best.
Hear me not. Hear me not.
And she bowed her head down in her lap, and Death took her child and went with it into the unknown land. The bell. People said.
The evening bell is sounding, the sun is setting.
For a strange wondrous tone was heard in the narrow streets of a large town. It was like the sound of a church bell, but it was only heard for a moment, for the rolling of the carriages and the voices of the multitude made too great a noise. Those persons who were walking outside the town, where the houses were farther apart, with gardens or little fields between them, could see the evening sky still better, and heard the sound of the bell much more distinctly. It was as if the tones came from a church in the still forest. People looked thitherward, and felt their minds attuned most solemnly. A long time passed, and people said to each other,
I wonder if there is a church out in the wood. The bell has a tone that is wondrous sweet. Let us stroll thither, and examine the matter nearer.
And the rich people drove out, and the poor walked, but the way seemed strangely long to them, and when they came to a clump of willows which grew on the skirts of the forest, they sat down, and looked up at the long branches, and fancied they were now in the depth of the greenwood. The confectioner of the town came out, and set up his booth there, and soon after came another confectioner, who hung a bell over his stand, as a sign or ornament, but it had no clapper, and it was tarred over to preserve it from the rain. When all the people returned home, they said it had been very romantic, and that it was quite a different sort of thing to a picnic or tea party. There were 3 persons who asserted they had penetrated to the end of the forest, and that they had always heard the wonderful sounds of the bell, but it had seemed to them as if it had come from the town. One wrote a whole poem about it, and said the bell sounded like the voice of a mother to a good dear child, and that no melody was sweeter than the tones of the bell. The king of the country was also observant of it, and vowed that he who could discover whence the sounds proceeded should have the title of
Universal bell ringer,
even if it were not really a bell. Many persons now went to the wood, for the sake of getting the place, but one only returned with a sort of explanation, for nobody went far enough, that one not further than the others. However, he said that the sound proceeded from a very large owl, in a hollow tree, a sort of learned owl, that continually knocked its head against the branches. But whether the sound came from his head or from the hollow tree, that no one could say with certainty. So now he got the place of
Universal bell ringer,
and wrote yearly a short treatise
on the owl.
But everybody was just as wise as before. It was the day of confirmation. The clergyman had spoken so touchingly, the children who were confirmed had been greatly moved. It was an eventful day for them. From children they become all at once grown-up persons. It was as if their infant souls were now to fly all at once into persons with more understanding. The sun was shining gloriously, the children that had been confirmed went out of the town, and from the wood was borne towards them the sounds of the unknown bell with wonderful distinctness. They all immediately felt a wish to go thither, all except 3. One of them had to go home to try on a ball dress, for it was just the dress and the ball which had caused her to be confirmed this time, for otherwise she would not have come. The other was a poor boy, who had borrowed his coat and boots to be confirmed in from the innkeeper's son, and he was to give them back by a certain hour. The third said that he never went to a strange place if his parents were not with him, that he had always been a good boy hitherto, and would still be so now that he was confirmed, and that one ought not to laugh at him for it. The others, however, did make fun of him, after all. There were 3, therefore, that did not go, the others hastened on. The sun shone, the birds sang, and the children sang too, and each held the other by the hand, for as yet they had none of them any high office, and were all of equal rank in the eye of God. But 2 of the youngest soon grew tired, and both returned to town. 2 little girls sat down, and twined garlands, so they did not go either, and when the others reached the willow tree, where the confectioner was, they said,
"Now we are there." In reality the bell does not exist, it is only a fancy that people have taken into their heads.
At the same moment the bell sounded deep in the wood, so clear and solemnly that 5 or 6 determined to penetrate somewhat further. It was so thick, and the foliage so dense, that it was quite fatiguing to proceed. Woodroof and anemones grew almost too high, blooming convolvuluses and blackberry bushes hung in long garlands from tree to tree, where the nightingale sang and the sunbeams were playing. It was very beautiful. But it was no place for girls to go, their clothes would get so torn. Large blocks of stone lay there, overgrown with moss of every color. The fresh spring bubbled forth, and made a strange gurgling sound.
"That surely cannot be the bell,"
said one of the children, lying down and listening.
"This must be looked to."
So he remained, and let the others go on without him. They afterwards came to a little house, made of branches and the bark of trees. A large wild apple tree bent over it, as if it would shower down all its blessings on the roof, where roses were blooming. The long stems twined round the gable, on which there hung a small bell. Was it that which people had heard? Yes, everybody was unanimous on the subject, except one, who said that the bell was too small and too fine to be heard at so great a distance, and besides it was very different tones to those that could move a human heart in such a manner. It was a king's son who spoke, whereon the others said,
"Such people always want to be wiser than everybody else."
They now let him go on alone, and as he went, his breast was filled more and more with the forest solitude, but he still heard the little bell with which the others were so satisfied, and now and then, when the wind blew, he could also hear the people singing who were sitting at tea where the confectioner had his tent. But the deep sound of the bell rose louder, it was almost as if an organ were accompanying it, and the tones came from the left hand, the side where the heart is placed. A rustling was heard in the bushes, and a little boy stood before the king's son, a boy in wooden shoes, and with so short a jacket that one could see what long wrists he had. Both knew each other. The boy was that one among the children who could not come, because he had to go home and return his jacket and boots to the innkeeper's son. This he had done, and was now going on in wooden shoes and in his humble dress, for the bell sounded with so deep a tone, and with such strange power, that proceed he must.
"Why, then, we can go together,"
said the king's son. But the poor child that had been confirmed was quite ashamed. He looked at his wooden shoes, pulled at the short sleeves of his jacket, and said that he was afraid he could not walk so fast. Besides, he thought that the bell must be looked for to the right, for that was the place where all sorts of beautiful things were to be found.
"But there we shall not meet,"
said the king's son, nodding at the same time to the poor boy, who went into the darkest, thickest part of the wood, where thorns tore his humble dress, and scratched his face and hands and feet till they bled. The king's son got some scratches too, but the sun shone on his path, and it is him that we will follow, for he was an excellent and resolute youth.
I must and will find the bell,
Said he.
even if I am obliged to go to the end of the world.
The ugly apes sat upon the trees, and grinned.
Shall we thrash him?
Said they.
Shall we thrash him? He is the son of a king.
But on he went, without being disheartened, deeper and deeper into the wood, where the most wonderful flowers were growing. There stood white lilies with blood-red stamina, sky-blue tulips, which shone as they waved in the winds, and apple trees, the apples of which looked exactly like large soap bubbles. So only think how the trees must have sparkled in the sunshine. Around the nicest green meads, where the deer were playing in the grass, grew magnificent oaks and beeches, and if the bark of one of the trees was cracked, their grass and long creeping plants grew in the crevices. And there were large calm lakes there too, in which white swans were swimming, and beat the air with their wings. The king's son often stood still and listened. He thought the bell sounded from the depths of these still lakes, but then he remarked again that the tone proceeded not from there, but farther off, from out the depths of the forest. The sun now set, the atmosphere glowed like fire. It was still in the woods, so very still, and he fell on his knees, sung his evening hymn, and said,
I cannot find what I seek, the sun is going down, and night is coming. The dark, dark night. Yet perhaps I may be able once more to see the round red sun, before he entirely disappears. I will climb up yonder rock.
And he seized hold of the creeping plants, and the roots of trees climbed up the moist stones where the water snakes were writhing and the toads were croaking, and he gained the summit before the sun had quite gone down. How magnificent was the sight from this height! The sea, the great, the glorious sea, that dashed its long waves against the coast, was stretched out before him. And yonder, where sea and sky meet, stood the sun, like a large shining altar, all melted together in the most glowing colors. And the wood and the sea sang a song of rejoicing, and his heart sang with the rest. All nature was a vast holy church, in which the trees and the buoyant clouds were the pillars, flowers and grass the velvet carpeting, and heaven itself the large cupola. The red colors above faded away as the sun vanished, but 1,000,000 stars were lighted, 1,000,000 lamps shone, and the king's son spread out his arms towards heaven, and wood, and sea, when at the same moment, coming by a path to the right, appeared, in his wooden shoes and jacket, the poor boy who had been confirmed with him. He had followed his own path, and had reached the spot just as soon as the son of the king had done. They ran towards each other, and stood together hand in hand in the vast church of nature and of poetry, while over them sounded the invisible holy bell. Blessed spirits floated around them, and lifted up their voices in a rejoicing hallelujah. The Dream of Little Took. Ah! Yes, that was Little Took. In reality his name was not Took, but that was what he called himself before he could speak plain. He meant it for Charles, and it is all well enough if one does but know it. He had now to take care of his little sister Augusta, who was much younger than himself, and he was, besides, to learn his lesson at the same time, but these two things would not do together at all. There sat the poor little fellow, with his sister on his lap, and he sang to her all the songs he knew, and he glanced the while from time to time into the geography book that lay open before him. By the next morning he was to have learnt all the towns in Zealand by heart, and to know about them all that is possible to be known. His mother now came home, for she had been out, and took little Augusta on her arm. Took ran quickly to the window, and read so eagerly that he pretty nearly read his eyes out, for it got darker and darker, but his mother had no money to buy a candle.
There goes the old washerwoman over the way,
said his mother, as she looked out of the window.
The poor woman can hardly drag herself along, and she must now drag the pail home from the fountain. Be a good boy, Tukey, and run across and help the old woman, won't you?
So Tuk ran over quickly and helped her, but when he came back again into the room it was quite dark, and as to a light, there was no thought of such a thing. He was now to go to bed. That was an old turn-up bedstead. In it he lay and thought about his geography lesson, and of Zealand, and of all that his master had told him. He ought, to be sure, to have read over his lesson again, but that, you know, he could not do. He therefore put his geography book under his pillow, because he had heard that was a very good thing to do when one wants to learn one's lesson, but one cannot, however, rely upon it entirely. Well, there he lay, and thought, and all at once it was just as if someone kissed his eyes and mouth. He slept, and yet he did not sleep. It was as though the old washerwoman gazed on him with her mild eyes and said,
"It were a great sin if you were not to know your lesson tomorrow morning. You have aided me, I therefore will now help you, and the loving God will do so at all times."
And all of a sudden the book under Tuke's pillow began scraping and scratching.
Kiki-ki. Cluck. Cluck. Cluck.
That was an old hen who came creeping along, and she was from Kyoga.
"I am a Kyoga hen,"
said she, and then she related how many inhabitants there were there, and about the battle that had taken place, and which, after all, was hardly worth talking about.
Cribbledy, crabbledy, plump.
Down fell somebody. It was a wooden bird, the popinjay used at the shooting matches at Prasto. Now he said that there were just as many inhabitants as he had nails in his body, and he was very proud.
Torvaldsen lived almost next door to me. Plump. Here I lie capitally.
But little Tuke was no longer lying down. All at once he was on horseback. On he went at full gallop, still galloping on and on. A knight with a gleaming plume, and most magnificently dressed, held him before him on the horse, and thus they rode through the wood to the old town of Vordingborg, and that was a large and very lively town. High towers rose from the castle of the king, and the brightness of many candles streamed from all the windows. Within was dance and song, and King Valdemar and the young, richly attired maids of honor danced together. The morn now came, and as soon as the sun appeared, the whole town and the king's palace crumbled together, and one tower after the other, and at last only a single one remained standing where the castle had been before. And the town was so small and poor. And the schoolboys came along with their books under their arms and said,
2,000 inhabitants.
But that was not true, for there were not so many. And little Tuke lay in his bed. It seemed to him as if he dreamed, and yet as if he were not dreaming. However, somebody was close beside him.
Little Tuke. Little Tuke.
Cried someone near. It was a seaman, quite a little personage, so little as if he were a midshipman, but a midshipman it was not.
Many remembrances from Corsa. That is a town that is just rising into importance. A lively town that has steamboats and stagecoaches. Formerly people called it ugly, but that is no longer true. I lie on the sea,
said Corsa.
I have high roads and gardens, and I have given birth to a poet who was witty and amusing, which all poets are not. I once intended to equip a ship that was to sail all round the earth, but I did not do it, although I could have done so. And then, too, I smell so deliciously, for close before the gate bloom the most beautiful roses.
Little Tuke looked, and all was red and green before his eyes. But as soon as the confusion of colors was somewhat over, all of a sudden there appeared a wooded slope close to the bay, and high up above stood a magnificent old church, with two high-pointed towers. From out the hillside spouted fountains in thick streams of water, so that there was a continual splashing, and close beside them sat an old king with a golden crown upon his white head. That was King Raw, near the fountains, close to the town of Roskilde, as it is now called. And up the slope into the old church went all the kings and queens of Denmark, hand in hand, all with their golden crowns, and the organ played and the fountains rustled. Little Tuke saw all, heard all.
Do not forget the diet,
said King Raw. Again all suddenly disappeared. Yes, and whither? It seemed to him just as if one turned over a leaf in a book. And now stood there an old peasant woman, who came from Soro, where grass grows in the marketplace. She had an old grey linen apron hanging over her head and back. It was so wet, it certainly must have been raining.
Yes, that it has,
said she, and she now related many pretty things out of Holberg's comedies, and about Valdemar and Absalon, but all at once she cowered together, and her head began shaking backwards and forwards, and she looked as she were going to make a spring.
Croak! Croak!
Said she.
It is wet, it is wet. There is such a pleasant death-like stillness in Sorb.
She was now suddenly a frog.
Croak!
And now she was an old woman.
One must dress according to the weather,
said she.
It is wet, it is wet. My town is just like a bottle, and one gets in by the neck, and by the neck one must get out again. In former times I had the finest fish, and now I have fresh rosy-cheeked boys at the bottom of the bottle, who learn wisdom, Hebrew, Greek, croak.
When she spoke it sounded just like the noise of frogs, or as if one walked with great boots over a moor, always the same tone, so uniform, and so tiring that little Took fell into a good sound sleep, which, by the by, could not do him any harm. But even in this sleep there came a dream, or whatever else it was. His little sister Augusta, she with the blue eyes and the fair curling hair, was suddenly a tall, beautiful girl, and without having wings was yet able to fly, and she now flew over Zealand, over the green woods and the blue lakes.
Do you hear the cock crow, Chooky? Cock-a-doodle-doo. The cocks are flying up from Kyoga. You will have a farmyard, so large, oh, so very large. You will suffer neither hunger nor thirst. You will get on in the world. You will be a rich and happy man. Your house will exalt itself like King Valdemar's tower, and will be richly decorated with marble statues, like that at Prasto. You understand what I mean. Your name shall circulate with renown all round the earth, like unto the ship that was to have sailed from Corsa, and in Roskilde. Do not forget the diet,
said King Roar.
Then you will speak well and wisely, little Chooky, and when at last you sink into your grave, you shall sleep as quietly as if I lay in sorrow,
said Took, awaking. It was bright day, and he was now quite unable to call to mind his dream. That, however, was not at all necessary, for one may not know what the future will bring. And out of bed he jumped, and read in his book, and now all at once he knew his whole lesson. And the old washerwoman popped her head in at the door, nodded to him friendly, and said,
Thanks, many thanks, my good child, for your help. May the good ever-loving God fulfill your loveliest dream.
Little Chooky did not at all know what he had dreamed, but the loving God knew it. The Elderbush. Once upon a time, there was a little boy who had taken cold. He had gone out and got his feet wet, though nobody could imagine how it had happened, for it was quite dry weather. So his mother undressed him, put him to bed, and had the teapot brought in, to make him a good cup of elderflower tea. Just at that moment the merry old man came in who lived up atop of the house all alone, for he had neither wife nor children, but he liked children very much, and knew so many fairy tales, that it was quite delightful.
Now drink your tea,
said the boy's mother.
Then, perhaps, you may hear a fairy tale. If I had but something new to tell,
said the old man.
But how did the child get his feet wet? That is the very thing that nobody can make out,
said his mother.
Am I to hear a fairy tale?
Asked the little boy.
Yes, if you can tell me exactly, for I must know that first how deep the gutter is in the little street opposite, that you pass through in going to school. Just up to the middle of my boot,
said the child.
But then I must go into the deep hole. Ah. That's where the wet feet came from,
said the old man.
I ought now to tell you a story, but I don't know any more. You can make one in a moment,
said the little boy.
My mother says that all you look at can be turned into a fairy tale, and that you can find a story in everything. Yes, but such tales and stories are good for nothing. The right sort come of themselves, they tap at my forehead and say, here we are. Won't there be a tap soon?
Asked the little boy. And his mother laughed, put some elderflowers in the teapot, and poured boiling water upon them.
Do tell me something. Pray do. Yes, if a fairy tale would come of its own accord, but they are proud and haughty, and come only when they choose. Stop,
said he, all on a sudden.
I have it. Pay attention. There is one in the teapot.
And the little boy looked at the teapot. The cover rose more and more, and the elderflowers came forth so fresh and white, and shot up long branches. Out of the spout even did they spread themselves on all sides, and grew larger and larger. It was a splendid elderbush, a whole tree, and it reached into the very bed, and pushed the curtains aside. How it bloomed! And what an odor! In the middle of the bush sat a friendly-looking old woman in a most strange dress. It was quite green, like the leaves of the elder, and was trimmed with large white elderflowers, so that at first one could not tell whether it was a stuff, or a natural green and real flowers.
What's that woman's name?
Asked the little boy.
The Greeks and Romans,
Said the old man.
called her a dryad, but that we do not understand. The people who live in the new booths have a much better name for her. They call her Old Granny, and she it is to whom you are to pay attention. Now listen, and look at the beautiful elderbush. Just such another large, blooming elder tree stands near the new booths. It grew there in the corner of a little miserable courtyard, and under it sat, of an afternoon, in the most splendid sunshine, two old people, an old, old seaman, and his old, old wife. They had great-grandchildren, and was soon to celebrate the 50th anniversary of their marriage, but they could not exactly recollect the date, and old Granny sat in the tree, and looked as pleased as now. I know the date, said she, but those below did not hear her, for they were talking about old times. Yes, can't you remember when we were very little, said the old seaman, and ran and played about. It was the very same courtyard where we now are, and we stuck slips in the ground, and made a garden. I remember it well, said the old woman, I remember it quite well. We watered the slips, and one of them was an elderbush. It took root, put forth green shoots, and grew up to be the large tree under which we old folks are now sitting. To be sure, said he. And there in the corner stood a water pail, where I used to swim my boats. True, but first we went to school to learn somewhat, said she, and then we were confirmed. We both cried, but in the afternoon we went up the round tower, and looked down on Copenhagen, and far, far away over the water. Then we went to Frederiksberg, where the king and the queen were sailing about in their splendid barges. But I had a different sort of sailing to that, later, and that, too, for many a year, a long way off, on great voyages. Yes, many a time have I wept for your sake, said she. I thought you were dead and gone, and lying down in the deep waters. Many a night have I got up to see if the wind had not changed, and changed it had, sure enough, but you never came. I remember so well one day, when the rain was pouring down in torrents, the scavengers were before the house where I was in service, and I had come up with the dust, and remained standing at the door. It was dreadful weather, when just as I was there, the postman came and gave me a letter. It was from you. What a tour that letter had made! I opened it instantly and read. I laughed and wept. I was so happy. In it I read that you were in warm lands where the coffee tree grows. What a blessed land that must be! You related so much, and I saw it all the while the rain was pouring down, and I standing there with the dust box. At the same moment came someone who embraced me. Yes, but you gave him a good box on his ear that made it tingle. But I did not know it was you. You arrived as soon as your letter, and you were so handsome that you still are, and had a long yellow silk handkerchief round your neck, and a brand new hat on. Oh, you were so dashing. Good heavens! What weather it was, and what a state the street was in. And then we married, said he. Don't you remember? And then we had our first little boy, and then Mary, and Nicholas, and Peter, and Christian. Yes, and how they all grew up to be honest people, and were beloved by everybody. And their children also have children, said the old sailor. Yes, those are our grandchildren, full of strength and vigor. It was, methinks, about this season that we had our wedding. Yes, this very day is the 50th anniversary of the marriage, said old Granny, sticking her head between the two old people, who thought it was their neighbor who nodded to them. They looked at each other and held one another by the hand. Soon after came their children, and their grandchildren, for they knew well enough that it was the day of the 50th anniversary, and had come with their gratulations that very morning, but the old people had forgotten it, although they were able to remember all that had happened many years ago. And the elderbush sent forth a strong odor in the sun, that was just about to set, and shone right in the old people's faces. They both looked so rosy-cheeked, and the youngest of the grandchildren danced around them, and called out quite delighted, that there was to be something very splendid that evening. They were all to have hot potatoes. And old Nanny nodded in the bush, and shouted hurrah with the rest. But that is no fairy tale,
said the little boy, who was listening to the story.
The thing is, you must understand it,
said the narrator.
Let us ask old Nanny. That was no fairy tale, 'tis true,
said old Nanny.
But now it's coming. The most wonderful fairy tales grow out of that which is reality. Were that not the case, you know, my magnificent elderbush could not have grown out of the teapot.
And then she took the little boy out of bed, laid him on her bosom, and the branches of the elder tree, full of flowers, closed around her. They sat in an aerial dwelling, and it flew with them through the air. Oh, it was wondrous beautiful. Old Nanny had grown all of a sudden a young and pretty maiden, but her robe was still the same green stuff with white flowers, which she had worn before. On her bosom she had a real elderflower, and in her yellow waving hair a wreath of the flowers. Her eyes were so large and blue that it was a pleasure to look at them. She kissed the boy, and now they were of the same age and felt alike. Hand in hand they went out of the bower, and they were standing in the beautiful garden of their home. Near the green lawn Papa's walking stick was tied, and for the little ones it seemed to be endowed with life, for as soon as they got astride it, the round polished knob was turned into a magnificent neighing head, a long black mane fluttered in the breeze, and 4 slender yet strong legs shot out. The animal was strong and handsome, and away they went at full gallop round the lawn.
Huzzah! Now we are riding miles off,
said the boy.
We are riding away to the castle where we were last year.
And on they rode round the grass plot, and the little maiden, who, we know, was no one else but old Nanny, kept on crying out.
Now we are in the country. Don't you see the farmhouse yonder? And there is an elder tree standing beside it, and the cock is scraping away the earth for the hens. Look, how he struts. And now we are close to the church. It lies high upon the hill, between the large oak trees, one of which is half decayed. And now we are by the smithy, where the fire is blazing, and where the half-naked men are banging with their hammers till the sparks fly about. Away! Away! To the beautiful country seat.
And all that the little maiden, who sat behind on the stick, spoke of, flew by in reality. The boy saw it all, and yet they were only going round the grass plot. Then they played in a side avenue, and marked out a little garden on the earth, and they took elder blossoms from their hair, planted them, and they grew just like those the old people planted when they were children, as related before. They went hand in hand, as the old people had done when they were children, but not to the Round Tower, or to Fredericksburg. No, the little damsel wound her arms round the boy, and then they flew far away through all Denmark. And spring came, and summer, and then it was autumn, and then winter, and 1,000 pictures were reflected in the eye and in the heart of the boy, and the little girl always sang to him.
This you will never forget.
And during their whole flight the elder tree smelt so sweet and odorous. He remarked the roses and the fresh beeches, but the elder tree had a more wondrous fragrance, for its flowers hung on the breast of the little maiden, and there, too, did he often lay his head during the flight.
It is lovely here in spring,
said the young maiden. And they stood in a beechwood that had just put on its first green, where the woodroof at their feet sent forth its fragrance, and the pale red anemone looked so pretty among the verdure.
Oh, would it were always spring in the sweetly smelling Danish beech forests. It is lovely here in summer,
said she. And she flew past old castles of bygone days of chivalry, where the red walls and the embattled gables were mirrored in the canal, where the swans were swimming, and peered up into the old cool avenues. In the fields the corn was waving like the sea, in the ditches red and yellow flowers were growing, while wild drone flowers and blooming convolvuluses were creeping in the hedges, and towards evening the moon rose round and large, and the haycocks in the meadows smelt so sweetly.
This one never forgets. It is lovely here in autumn,
said the little maiden. And suddenly the atmosphere grew as blue again as before, the forest grew red, and green, and yellow-colored. The dogs came leaping along, and whole flocks of wildfowl flew over the cairn, where blackberry bushes were hanging round the old stones. The sea was dark blue, covered with ships full of white sails, and in the barn old women, maidens, and children were sitting picking hops into a large cask. The young sang songs, but the old told fairy tales of mountain sprites and soothsayers. Nothing could be more charming.
It is delightful here in winter,
said the little maiden. And all the trees were covered with hoarfrost, they looked like white corals, the snow crackled underfoot, as if one had new boots on, and one falling star after the other was seen in the sky. The Christmas tree was lighted in the room, presents were there, and good humour reigned. In the country the violin sounded in the room of the peasant, the newly baked cakes were attacked, even the poorest child said,
"It is really delightful here in winter."
Yes, it was delightful, and the little maiden showed the boy everything, and the elder tree still was fragrant, and the red flag, with the white cross, was still waving, the flag under which the old seamen in the new booths had sailed. And the boy grew up to be a lad, and was to go forth in the wide world far, far away to warm lands, where the coffee tree grows. But at his departure the little maiden took an elder blossom from her bosom, and gave it him to keep. And it was placed between the leaves of his prayer book. And when in foreign lands he opened the book, it was always at the place where the keepsake flower lay. And the more he looked at it, the fresher it became. He felt, as it were, the fragrance of the Danish groves, and from among the leaves of the flowers he could distinctly see the little maiden, peeping forth with her bright blue eyes, and then she whispered,
"It is delightful here in spring, summer, autumn, and winter."
And 100 visions glided before his mind. Thus passed many years, and he was now an old man, and sat with his old wife under the blooming tree. They held each other by the hand, as the old grandfather and grandmother yonder in the new booths did, and they talked exactly like them of old times, and of the 50th anniversary of their wedding. The little maiden, with the blue eyes, and with elder blossoms in her hair, sat in the tree, nodded to both of them, and said,
"Today is the 50th anniversary."
And then she took 2 flowers out of her hair, and kissed them. First, they shone like silver, then like gold, and when they laid them on the heads of the old people, each flower became a golden crown. So there they both sat, like a king and a queen, under the fragrant tree, that looked exactly like an elder. The old man told his wife the story of
Old Nanny,
as it had been told him when a boy. And it seemed to both of them it contained much that resembled their own history, and those parts that were like it pleased them best.
"Thus it is,"
said the little maiden in the tree.
"Some call me Old Nanny, others a Dryad, but, in reality, my name is Remembrance. 'Tis I who sit in the tree that grows and grows. I can remember, I can tell things. Let me see if you have my flower still."
And the old man opened his prayer book. There lay the elder blossom, as fresh as if it had been placed there but a short time before, and Remembrance nodded, and the old people, decked with crowns of gold, sat in the flush of the evening Sunday. They closed their eyes, and yes, that's the end of the story. The little boy lay in his bed. He did not know if he had dreamed or not, or if he had been listening while someone told him the story. The teapot was standing on the table, but no elder tree was growing out of it. And the old man, who had been talking, was just on the point of going out at the door, and he did go.
"How splendid that was,"
said the little boy.
"Mother, I have been to warm countries." "So I should think,"
said his mother.
"When one has drunk 2 good cupfuls of elderflower tea, 'tis likely enough one goes into warm climates.
And she tucked him up nicely, lest he should take cold.
You have had a good sleep while I have been sitting here, and arguing with him whether it was a story or a fairy tale. And where is old Nanny?
Asked the little boy.
In the teapot,
Said his mother.
and there she may remain.
The red shoes. There was once a little girl who was very pretty and delicate, but in summer she was forced to run about with bare feet, she was so poor, and in winter wear very large wooden shoes, which made her little insteps quite red, and that looked so dangerous. In the middle of the village lived old Dame Shoemaker. She sat and sewed together, as well as she could, a little pair of shoes out of old red strips of cloth. They were very clumsy, but it was a kind thought. They were meant for the little girl. The little girl was called Karen. On the very day her mother was buried, Karen received the red shoes, and wore them for the first time. They were certainly not intended for mourning, but she had no others, and with stockingless feet she followed the poor straw coffin in them. Suddenly a large old carriage drove up, and a large old lady sat in it. She looked at the little girl, felt compassion for her, and then said to the clergyman,
Here, give me the little girl. I will adopt her.
And Karen believed all this happened on account of the red shoes, but the old lady thought they were horrible, and they were burnt. But Karen herself was cleanly and nicely dressed. She must learn to read and sew, and people said she was a nice little thing, but the looking-glass said,
Thou art more than nice, thou art beautiful.
Now the queen once travelled through the land, and she had her little daughter with her. And this little daughter was a princess, and people streamed to the castle, and Karen was there also, and the little princess stood in her fine white dress, in a window, and let herself be stared at. She had neither train nor golden crown, but splendid red morocco shoes. They were certainly far handsomer than those Dame Shoemaker had made for little Karen. Nothing in the world can be compared with red shoes. Now Karen was old enough to be confirmed. She had new clothes and was to have new shoes also. The rich shoemaker in the city took the measure of her little foot. This took place at his house, in his room, where stood large glass cases, filled with elegant shoes and brilliant boots. All this looked charming, but the old lady could not see well, and so had no pleasure in them. In the midst of the shoes stood a pair of red ones, just like those the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! The shoemaker said also they had been made for the child of a count, but had not fitted.
That must be patent leather,
said the old lady.
They shine so. Yes, they shine,
said Karen, and they fitted, and were bought, but the old lady knew nothing about their being red, else she would never have allowed Karen to have gone in red shoes to be confirmed. Yet such was the case. Everybody looked at her feet, and when she stepped through the chancel door on the church pavement, it seemed to her as if the old figures on the tombs, those portraits of old preachers and preachers' wives, with stiff ruffs and long black dresses, fixed their eyes on her red shoes. And she thought only of them as the clergyman laid his hand upon her head, and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and how she should be now a matured Christian, and the organ pealed so solemnly, the sweet children's voices sang, and the old music directors sang, but Karen only thought of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from everyone that the shoes had been red, and she said that it was very wrong of Karen, that it was not at all becoming, and that in future Karen should only go in black shoes to church, even when she should be older. The next Sunday there was the sacrament, and Karen looked at the black shoes, looked at the red ones, looked at them again, and put on the red shoes. The sun shone gloriously. Karen and the old lady walked along the path through the corn. It was rather dusty there. At the church door stood an old soldier with a crutch, and with a wonderfully long beard, which was more red than white, and he bowed to the ground, and asked the old lady whether he might dust her shoes. And Karen stretched out her little foot.
See, what beautiful dancing shoes,
said the soldier.
Sit firm when you dance.
And he put his hand out towards the soles. And the old lady gave the old soldier alms, and went into the church with Karen. And all the people in the church looked at Karen's red shoes, and all the pictures, and as Karen knelt before the altar, and raised the cup to her lips, she only thought of the red shoes, and they seemed to swim in it, and she forgot to sing her psalm, and she forgot to pray.
Our Father in heaven.
Now all the people went out of church, and the old lady got into her carriage. Karen raised her foot to get in after her, when the old soldier said,
Look, what beautiful dancing shoes.
And Karen could not help dancing a step or two, and when she began her feet continued to dance. It was just as though the shoes had power over them. She danced round the church corner, she could not leave off, the coachman was obliged to run after and catch hold of her, and he lifted her in the carriage, but her feet continued to dance so that she trod on the old lady dreadfully. At length she took the shoes off, and then her legs had peace. The shoes were placed in a closet at home, but Karen could not avoid looking at them. Now the old lady was sick, and it was said she could not recover. She must be nursed and waited upon, and there was no one whose duty it was so much as Karen's. But there was a great ball in the city, to which Karen was invited. She looked at the old lady, who could not recover, she looked at the red shoes, and she thought there could be no sin in it. She put on the red shoes, she might do that also, she thought. But then she went to the ball and began to dance. When she wanted to dance to the right, the shoes would dance to the left, and when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced back again, down the steps, into the street, and out of the city gate. She danced, and was forced to dance straight out into the gloomy wood. Then it was suddenly light up among the trees, and she fancied it must be the moon, for there was a face, but it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there, nodded his head, and said,
Look, what beautiful dancing shoes.
Then she was terrified, and wanted to fling off the red shoes, but they clung fast, and she pulled down her stockings, but the shoes seemed to have grown to her feet. And she danced, and must dance, over fields and meadows, in rain and sunshine, by night and day, but at night it was the most fearful. She danced over the churchyard, but the dead did not dance, they had something better to do than to dance. She wished to seat herself on a poor man's grave, where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was neither peace nor rest, and when she danced towards the open church door, she saw an angel standing there. He wore long, white garments, he had wings which reached from his shoulders to the earth, his countenance was severe and grave, and in his hand he held a sword, broad and glittering.
Dance shalt thou,
said he.
Dance in thy red shoes till thou art pale and cold. Till thy skin shrivels up and thou art a skeleton. Dance shalt thou from door to door, and where proud, vain children dwell, thou shalt knock, that they may hear thee and tremble. Dance shalt thou. Mercy,
cried Karen. But she did not hear the angel's reply, for the shoes carried her through the gate into the fields, across roads and bridges, and she must keep ever dancing. One morning she danced past a door which she well knew. Within sounded a psalm, a coffin, decked with flowers, was borne forth. Then she knew that the old lady was dead, and felt that she was abandoned by all, and condemned by the angel of God. She danced, and she was forced to dance through the gloomy night. The shoes carried her over stack and stone, she was torn till she bled, she danced over the heath till she came to a little house. Here, she knew, dwelt the executioner, and she tapped with her fingers at the window, and said,
Come out. Come out. I cannot come in, for I am forced to dance.
And the executioner said,
Thou dost not know who I am, I fancy. I strike bad people's heads off, and I hear that my axe rings. Don't strike my head off,
said Karen.
Then I can't repent of my sins. But strike off my feet in the red shoes.
And then she confessed her entire sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep wood. And he carved out little wooden feet for her, and crutches, taught her the psalm criminals always sing, and she kissed the hand which had wielded the axe, and went over the heath.
Now I have suffered enough for the red shoes,
said she.
Now I will go into the church that people may see me.
And she hastened towards the church door. But when she was near it, the red shoes danced before her, and she was terrified, and turned round. The whole week she was unhappy, and wept many bitter tears, but when Sunday returned, she said,
Well, now I have suffered and struggled enough. I really believe I am as good as many a one who sits in the church, and holds her head so high.
And away she went boldly. But she had not got farther than the churchyard gate before she saw the red shoes dancing before her, and she was frightened, and turned back, and repented of her sin from her heart. And she went to the parsonage, and begged that they would take her into service. She would be very industrious, she said, and would do everything she could. She did not care about the wages, only she wished to have a home, and be with good people. And the clergyman's wife was sorry for her and took her into service, and she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat still and listened when the clergyman read the Bible in the evenings. All the children thought a great deal of her, but when they spoke of dress, and grandeur, and beauty, she shook her head. The following Sunday, when the family was going to church, they asked her whether she would not go with them, but she glanced sorrowfully, with tears in her eyes, at her crutches. The family went to hear the word of God, but she went alone into her little chamber. There was only room for a bed and chair to stand in it, and here she sat down with her prayer book, and whilst she read with a pious mind, the wind bore the strains of the organ towards her, and she raised her tearful countenance, and said,
O God, help me.
And the sun shone so clearly, and straight before her stood the angel of God in white garments, the same she had seen that night at the church door, but he no longer carried the sharp sword, but in its stead a splendid green spray, full of roses. And he touched the ceiling with the spray, and the ceiling rose so high, and where he had touched it there gleamed a golden star. And he touched the walls, and they widened out, and she saw the organ which was playing. She saw the old pictures of the preachers and the preachers' wives. The congregation sat in cushioned seats, and sang out of their prayer books. For the church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow chamber, or else she had come into the church. She sat in the pew with the clergyman's family, and when they had ended the psalm and looked up, they nodded and said,
It is right that thou art come. It was through mercy,
she said. And the organ pealed, and the children's voices in the choir sounded so sweet and soft. The clear sunshine streamed so warmly through the window into the pew where Karen sat. Her heart was so full of sunshine, peace, and joy that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunshine to God, and then no one asked after the red shoes.